The Canadian advocacy group Animal Justice has drafted a proposed Animal Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which would enshrine the basic rights and freedoms of animals as common law. The saying goes, you can judge a society by how they treat their most vulnerable, and Animal Justice puts animals in that category. It hopes the charter would offer better legal protection to abused animals, but others are not so convinced a charter is warranted. Is an Animal Charter of Rights and Freedoms the answer to stopping animal abuse? How would the charter change law practices in our province? And joining the conversation tonight is Christian Lim, Crown Prosecutor for Alberta Justice and Solicitor General, and Anna Pippis, Director of Farmed Animal Advocacy at Animal Justice, joining us tonight from Vancouver. Good evening, you two. Nice to have you on our show.
Good evening, Ms. Randolph.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Anna, let's start with you. What has been drafted in the simplest way that you can explain it?
The Animal Charter of Rights and Freedoms is really a proposed piece of legislation that would give animals meaningful rights and freedoms, perhaps most importantly of which is the right to go to court and have their rights represented by animal advocates, which is currently a very important right that they don't have. In human rights law, we say that there is no right without a remedy, and that's the situation that animals are facing. There are some laws on the books that offer them some protection, but animals have no way to go to court to assert those rights.
Okay, so that's the obvious difference then. The rights of animals differing from the rights of humans is the representation in court.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's one of the key differences that we see as incredibly problematic.
Okay, Christian, going to bring you in the conversation here and filling our viewers in on the two legislations that are focused on here in Alberta. So we have the Animal Protection Act, focusing on diligence for animal care, and the Criminal Code, focusing on intent to harm. Now, what many people have a problem with is the wording in the Criminal Code specifically that animals are classified as property. Does that make it difficult to prosecute?
Well, it's something you certainly have to consider when you're prosecuting, but the court system, the way it's developed in sentencing provisions, allow for a judge in sentencing to consider what is an animal and the fact that it's a living creature. It's not simply just an inanimate object. So we've had courts here in Edmonton, Alberta, for example, who've actually considered that while they are considered a piece of property, they definitely differ than a book or an inanimate object, and that has been affected the sentencing. It's in what we call the sentencing provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada. Likewise, under the provincial legislation, the Animal Protection Act, it recognizes already that specifically animals are deserving and are protected under the laws right here under the provincial legislation. Although that has to do more with due diligence, of course. It doesn't require intent. It's what we call a strict liability offence.
Okay. Well, the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies has been calling on the federal government to amend the animal cruelty sections of the Criminal Code for more than 25 years. CEO Barbara Cartwright has been quoted saying the Criminal Code hasn't had a significant update since 1892 in regards to animal cruelty. The language is outdated, the offences are outdated, and it uses terminology that is nearly impossible to prove in court. Anna, there are some people, though, that feel animals actually have more rights than seniors or those with disabilities. So what's your take on that mentality?
Well, I think that's simply wrong. I think it's important that all vulnerable segments of society, and that of course includes seniors, that of course includes all vulnerable segments, of which there are many, deserve protection under the law. But I think the problem with animals is that they really don't have the right to go to court and assert those rights. So we saw, for example, in the case of Lucy the elephant in the Edmonton Zoo, some advocates tried to go to court and say the city is in violation of this Animal Protection Act that does set out the rights that would have protected Lucy. And the court refused to hear the merits of the case. Instead of adjudicating whether or not the city was in fact violating the Animal Protection Act, they simply said, you don't have standing to be here, we don't want to hear it. This is an abuse of process. And in dissent, the Chief Justice of the Alberta Court of Appeal said, of course we should hear this case. Not only do we need to be hearing the voices of animal advocates through which we can hear the voices of animals, but as a matter of democracy and the rule of law, if we have these laws, then we need to be enforcing them. So the Animal Protection Act and the Criminal Code are no good to animals if they're not being used to protect them and if animals have no way of ensuring that they're protecting them.
Okay, Christian, so with enforcement, we talked a bit about the legislation in the province. How stiff are the penalties currently for animal abuse?
Currently, under the Animal Protection Act, you can a maximum of $20,000 fine. And of course, the government is constantly looking into updating or developing the law there. Under the criminal code, we can get up to a 5-year sentence. As well, both of them allow for prohibitions up to a lifetime. And there's also restitution, recognizing that animals, especially with the various humane societies, the SPCA, there's often costs that deal with the animals that are often abused. So there are ways of getting, obviously, restitution is one of the things that are allowed underneath the criminal code and the Animal Protection Act here in Alberta. So the laws are looking into trying to enforce it, of course, requires some help from the public and also working with our investigative agencies. In most cities, it will be like the policing agency, usually the city bylaw officers, and whatever's equivalent to the SPCA, or in this case in Edmonton, for example, the Edmonton Humane Society Animal Protection Officers.
And there have been many cases all across the province of animal abuses that have gone to the courts, some resulting in jail time. So are you finding that this is a deterrent, these penalties?
Well, essentially, the Crown or Alberta Justice sees us as being a voice for the voiceless, much as what sort of Anna is saying was required here. And the courts, we've noticed the laws has certainly been developing, if you want to call it that. And in other words, where in the past we may have received a fine for animal abuse, now, at least in Edmonton, since 2010, since we created a portfolio dealing with animal cruelty, we've only gotten jail on any criminal convictions. And I guess the point is that they certainly are recognizing that animals, the courts have said, animals are not just pieces of property, that they are, because they are actually vulnerable parts of society. And we can say the most vulnerable, referring to usually children, elderly, and handicapped or challenged individuals, also includes animals here. And so literally, shall we say, there is a voice for the voiceless. So we're trying to do that within the justice system. And you've seen the fines and everything. Fines under the Animal Protection Act have gone up significantly, probably tenfold. And now, for example, a person who may be having a rough day and essentially throws a dog against a wall, we're finding that the courts have given a 15-day period of incarceration. And if anyone knows the justice system, you'll see that incarceration is one of the last things they do because they believe in rehabilitation first. And so that says a lot that we're getting jail time for these crimes, which of course are crimes against animals, but it recognizes that they are vulnerable and that they are sensitive. They're not just an inanimate object.
Anna, you're hearing from Christian the successes here in Alberta. Still hearing that, is there a need overall for the whole country to have this charter then?
Well, I think what Christian's saying is really important because it's showing that there's a shift happening in society. We're in a very exciting time, in a sense, for animals because things really are changing for them. Concern about animals is a bipartisan issue. All demographics care about animals. And we're starting to really see this change. Now, the Animal Charter would not replace the Animal Protection Act or the Criminal Code provisions, animal cruelty provisions, but it would be complementary towards them. So although the law is starting to recognize animals as being sentient beings rather than property, and I completely agree with Christian on that, we still are lacking legal personhood for animals, which is strange because we actually have legal personhood for corporations under the law, for trusts under the law. So these are legal entities that are non-sentient, that can go to court to litigate their interests. But animals do not yet have this right. They're not seen as legal persons. And that's what I think is really missing from these laws. And until we have that, it's going to be a piecemeal approach of complaints to law enforcement bodies, of investigations by underfunded law enforcement bodies. But really, we're dealing with hundreds of millions of animals, so we can and should be doing much better for them.
Well, we've been talking a lot about domestic animals, or as you mentioned, Anna, some zoo animals, but how will the charter then balance farm animals' rights? A lot of people, their goal is simply to consume them.
Right, and I think that's a really important question. For a lot of people watching this, they might be thinking, well, I want to eat meat, so I think that's an important question to ask. But farmed animals are probably the most vulnerable animal members of our society because so many of them are suffering, are raised and killed for food every year in Canada, about 700 million of them. And also the Animal Welfare Protection Acts of all of the provinces in some way exclude some of the worst suffering that farmed animals are forced forced to endure. There are specific exemptions for farmed animals. So the Animal Charter would attempt to make up some of that lost ground by giving these animals the most important rights and freedoms that really should be considered very basic. So things like access to appropriate, species-appropriate food and water, access to clean and comfortable shelter, things as simple as the right to walk around and express normal and natural behaviors, which many people believe already is the law, would be guaranteed to farmed animals who are currently suffering in confinement systems like battery cages, gestation crates, things like that are just unacceptable to many people and many Canadian people in our society.
Christian, we've been talking about the laws, the enforcement, and you had touched on it earlier about the help from the public. That is ultimately how you begin with this, correct? People coming forward when they see the abuse.
That's correct. Basically, because animals can't speak, they often, and because they don't have appendages that allow them to get out of cars or the situation, people need to be the eyes and ears and the mouthpieces for the animals, and it's really important that they come forth. And part of the challenges that we have often is they come out of a domestic type of relationship, and a lot of people are afraid to speak up. And so it's really important, because in order for us to bring justice, to bring the truth out, we need the public to stand up for the animals, and also we need to continue on our development of educating the investigative agencies as well, because it is, like Anna's sort of suggesting, a developing, burgeoning area of law, and it's something that we need to do that is a real concern to the public. Even things like the victim impact statement, which basically means upon a sentencing, a person or someone involved in the animal abuse can hopefully give a statement as to how it affected the animal or them. There are some cases here in Canada that say that a victim impact statement does not apply to animals. Now, again, depends on what court, and it's still up in the air, so to speak, here, but that's obviously one of the things that we need to clarify. So it is definitely a developing area of law, and people are realizing that animals don't just fit into one little category here. And as one judge put it, they are not, quote, just animals, unquote. They're real creatures, as I think with Anna, and I don't mean to step on Anna's toes, but I think that's what she's saying, that we need to recognize that.
Exactly. So, Anna, with all of this, where's your group going now with the Charter? What's your next step in trying to see this implemented or even have some sort of changes to the laws?
Well, I think that for now we're trying to raise awareness about this as being such a critical issue for animals, and to get Canadians on board. So I encourage everyone to go to our website, animaljustice.ca, sign on to the Charter, and our next steps will be to get this legal personhood, this ability to go to court for animals, which is really a movement that's happening globally. So we're seeing countries all around the world trying to find a way of getting legal personhood, legal standing for animals. There are currently even court cases before courts of appeal in the United States that are trying to get this for animals. So we're going to be working towards it, and I think victory is really only inevitable. This is a truth whose time has come.
All right, thank you very much. The two of you will have to leave it there for time. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That was Christian Lim, Crown Prosecutor for Alberta Justice and Solicitor General, and joining us tonight from Vancouver, Anna Pippis, Director of Farmed Animal Advocacy at Animal Justice.